Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello. Welcome to New Books and Music, a channel on the New Books Network. My name is Bradley Morgan, and I am joined today by my guest, Jibola Fagbamiye and Conor McCreery. Jibola is a visual artist whose previous work includes Black AF, The Unwhitewashed Story of America, and Conor is a comic writer whose work has appeared in various publications, such as DC and Dark Horse. They collaborated together on their latest book, Fela, Music is the Weapon, published by Amistad. Jibola and Conor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us, Brad.
Thanks so much, Bradley.
So to get things started, can you share with us what your book is about?
Sure, absolutely. So our book is about a graphic novel about Fela Kuti, who's a Nigerian musician who uses music to bring down the Nigerian military government. And what's very interesting about Fela and what got me into it and got me to drag Conor along with me for the ride was that I grew up not too far from Fela's house in Lagos, right? And I would walk past his house all the time, and there were all these stories about him. But I didn't know enough about him at the time. There were these stories about him being this agitator, womanizer, and all of that. But that was generally all I knew about Fela. And fast forward to around 2007, 2008, I read this book called This Bitch of a Life by Carlos Moore. And I realized that, wait a minute, this guy's not just a musician and not just a political agitator. He's actually someone who went on to create his own artistic, political, and even spiritual ecosystem or universe, right? And you could start to argue that Fela is probably one of the most important artists of the last, say, 100 years, and not just in Africa, but around the world, because he started his own political movement called Movement of the People, ran for president of Nigeria. At one point, he declared his house an independent republic at a time when a genocide was happening in Nigeria in the eastern part of Nigeria, when the Igbos declared Biafra as an independent republic outside of Nigeria, and 1 million people died because of that. And Fela, around the same time, said, "Oh, his house is an independent republic," because he felt like the Nigerian military government was not a legitimate government. So the balls to do that was just amazing. He released over 70 albums in his lifetime, and his music has been remixed and sampled and is constantly studied. And he was arrested over 200 times. There was this one time where he sang this song called Zombie, and when the song was released, the government got so scared about the song that they literally sent 1,000 soldiers to burn his house down. And all this is happening not too far from where I live. And I kind of felt, shocked that I didn't know this. And I started to think to myself, wait, what else did I not know about my history, about my culture? So I became obsessed in wanting to tell the story. And it was very important to me to tell it in a very specific way where anyone that is not Nigerian, or even Nigerians who didn't know much about Fela or about Nigerian history, and we're getting to that generation of people who don't, right? Can plug into it and download that story in a fun, interesting way, especially in the West, when we consume stories from West Africa and from Nigeria. There is this flattening of our story, which kind of makes it feel like, oh, these people are just suffering, or this, just very almost stripping us of our personality, of our history. So it was very important for me to tell the story in a way where it shows the struggle, but yes, it shows our imagination, our magic, our mythology, our politics, like this whole 360 story. And, I it just so happens to be that when when we were about to release the book, right? We started working on it 10 years ago. We didn't know that the world was going to go to shit, right? And that we're gonna see this rise in authoritarianism, rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, and fascism on the rise in America and Europe and all over the world. So Fela's story just kind of seems like the story of right now. And Connor and I actually just did a talk last week about art as resistance. And Fela basically lived that, right? With his body, with his reputation, with his music. And I think this story is for someone who's kind of looking for some hope right now about what's happening in the world. Someone who's wants to learn about the world, learn about history, and learn about music. And yeah, that's the gist of it.
Well, I really appreciate you going through that with me. And we're going to be covering a lot of those stories that you mentioned because it is a very fascinating life and there is a lot to glean that's very relevant. And so let's get things started because Fela was born in Nigeria in 1938 when the nation was still under British colonial rule and the country would not achieve its independence until 1960. That colonialism and its aftermath would fuel much of Fela's revolutionary music later on, but before we get into that, can you set the scene, being from Lagos yourself, and tell us what life was like for Nigerians under that system when Fela was a child?
Oh, that's a good question. So, yeah, I'm not a historian and, I didn't grow up at that time. I can kind of go based on what I've read and based on what, my parents have told me. But um, I would say life under the British, colonialism just sort of washes away that work colonialism kind of like washes away the the impacts of the real impacts of colonialism, because on one hand you had a relatively stable foreign society, right, which was um you had the British building infrastructure, the roads around the country, churches, schools, and all of that, right? And it became the what was culturally important was for you to become more British, right? More Western, right? So people just naturally started to shed their Africanness in many ways, right? So Fela's initial name was Ransome-Kuti, right? Because Fela's grandfather took on the name of the person who took him to England, right, and eventually to Jerusalem. And so the, for you to be part of the elite or a symbol of the elitism was having an English name, right? But on the flip side of that, you also had, my dad grew up under free education, same with my mom, same with my grandfather, right? So you had those positives in a sense. But the negatives was, overwhelmingly more. You had us losing a huge chunk of our culture, of our history. A lot of the traditional um, spiritualism was demonized even till this day, right? So that was kind of like the context around what Fela was growing up in, right? So Fela grew up in a relatively Christian family. Like his grandfather, Jinche Ransome-Kuti, brought translated English hymns to Yoruba for Nigerians, right? And I think it was the first recorded artist coming out from Nigeria. So so when Fela grew up in that context, fast forward into like 1960s, 1970, where you have a Fela who is more of a Yoruba traditionalist, spiritualist, like this huge contradiction to what he would have grown up in.
Fela's father was a reverend, and he led the church choir, and he had a very strict demands that the music had to be performed correctly. Later, his father would pass away from prostate cancer in 1955, but Fela harbored some very conflicting emotions about his father. What impact did that have on Fela's own musical development early on?
So the way we just sort of portray that is that um Fela, Fela, yeah, historic. In Fela's biography, he was obviously, I think he loved his dad in some ways, but in other ways, he said my dad would kick his dad would kick his ass for no apparent reason. So did his mom, but that's also a different story. And I think the impact Fela's dad had on him was just his love for music and how he was so strict about making sure the music was done right, And I think that's a big thing that fella took away. There's this really famous story which we insinuated in the book, but we didn't exactly put it in. Is that fella actually got his band to perform for 24 hours, right? Just to get a sound right, right? That sounds like just the way he described his dad, sounds like something his dad would do, you know? So I think he just made him very serious, takes music very seriously and to not treat it as, like a hobby. And he made him care about repetition and the technicality of music, right? And he made sure the people around him also took music very seriously.
In your book, you describe Fela's father as a tiger, but that he was married to a lioness, and Fela's mother was very political and a respected figure throughout her community, and this would have an impact on Fela's own political development. You recall a story where his mother organized a movement to unite against the local ruler who was stealing from women in the market. Could you share us about that story?
Sure. So Conor and I actually wrote a small graphic novel, a small comic on this. It was about 10 or 11 pages long that just focused on his mom. I think in a different world, we would have actually loved the opportunity to just tell a whole graphic novel about his mom because she was a giant in her own right. And I'll get Conor to jump in on this too. So his mom was part of the people who led the Nigerian independence movement, was in the room when they were negotiating the British, when Nigeria uh, was negotiating independence from the British. Um, Now, what made her how she became well known in Nigeria was there was this king called the Alake in this town called Abeokuta, where Fela grew up, right? And the Alake and would was 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 a was a king that basically worked with the British, right? If you remember, the British actually did not rule Nigeria directly. They did something called indirect rule, where they would have local rulers that would answer to the British, right? And then the ruler would just sort of kind of like rule whatever community they were located in. So there are all these pictures. If you Google it, the Alake, you would actually see a white man standing behind him or next to him. So almost like his handler, so to speak, right? So there, and the other thing people also forget is that during World War II, when the world was fighting Hitler, a lot of the soldiers came from India, came from Africa, right? So and the food to feed the war effort also came from so many countries, right? Like countries like Nigeria, right? Um, and to fund the war against Hitler, a lot of the money came from Nigeria and so many different countries. So Fela's mom was fighting the Alake because a lot of the resources that were supposed to go to the community and the market women that were working in these communities were being taxed, right? So that the money could go to fight the war effort. So she started this huge movement that literally got 10,000 women to depose the king, right? And that women's movement was hugely influential to Fela's life, right? And um, you could even argue that that movement led to so many other movements around the world. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa had an impact. So many women's movement around the world. So I think Fela was hugely influenced by that because he was in the room when his mom was planning those events. He was in those protests with his mother, right? So you could imagine that he carried that along with him when you see uh, him singing a song like Zombie or Coffin of the Head of State when the Nigerian government killed his mom. Essentially, he took his mom's coffin to the the army barracks in Nigeria, right? And he led like so many people to protest the government like this, right? So I think that's kind of the impact his mom had in his life.
So when Fela was getting started on his music career, he left for Nigeria. He left Nigeria for London in the late 50s, and he told his family that he was going to be studying medicine, but he really went there to play music, and he performed as a trumpet player for a band called the Cool Cats. But Fela really hated his experience playing music in London. Can you tell us more about that?
So I don't know if he hated his experience playing with in London. I think London was where he just formed this identity as a musician, at least as a jazz player. He was influenced by Frank Sinatra and Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis and all of that, right? So I think that in London, he was just trying to figure out what his identity was. And we try to paint that picture. There's a really famous story that when the first time Fela performed on stage, that people literally laughed him off stage, you know? So, and we wanted to ground the reader in that beginning because the Fela's musical journey in the graphic novel starts there where he performs and the people laugh at him. And you juxtapose that to later in the book where he's people are almost worshiping him on stage, right? And there's this really beautiful juxtaposition that we do where in the first couple of pages when he sang then people are shocked um and they're not sure how to process the music the first time towards later on in the book about the 200-page mark where he performed Zombie, and it's the same positioning too, that the people are ecstatic and just blown away by his musical performance and what he's able to do with his music, right? So we what we do beautifully is just help the user connect that journey and tell that story.
Fela was arrested over 200 times throughout his life, but before all that, his path toward being a revolutionary didn't come naturally to him, and he needed something to push him in that direction. Could you tell us about the first time he was arrested during his stay in London?
Yeah, so the first time he was arrested in London was so Fela would when he was starting out would have these parties at his house, right? Um, and then y- you would imagine that he has neighbors, right? So he's playing music, he had guys playing drums and all of that. And we introduced this character who was his landlady or this lady who lived below him. And she called the cops to say, hey, these college kids making a lot of noise, right? Um, yeah, and then the next day the cops come in and they knock on the door and they say, "Hey, you're making a lot of noise with your music." And Fela says, "Hey, you have to music has to be done right, so I can't do it half-ass. So if I'm doing it properly, I have to make a lot of noise." And then um he be this he said to be cheeky and be a trickster a little bit, and that kind of annoyed the cops, and they arrested him, right? But they didn't really have a reason for arresting him. Just I think it was just being an ass, and that's kind of why they arrested him. Um, and and um and actually, I'm gonna get Connor to talk about this because he actually does a better job telling this story.
I was going to say, I mean, I was only going to say that at the very end, one of my favorite bits, which actually didn't make it into the book, is Fela talks about how after he was, self-admittedly being a bit of an asshole, because, it's that kind of the buried revolutionary spirit that was kind of infused in him by his mother and by his father. One of the things we didn't speak about his father is he actually ran a school in Fela's hometown that the British would come to inspect. But because it wasn't actually funded by the government, the British didn't have any right to inspect the school. But of course they did anyways, because we're the British and we can do what we want. And so there's sort of a famous story of him chasing a school inspector away. And another story of him almost losing an eye while confronting a British officer because he almost got bayoneted. So there was always this, you get the sense that while Fela was raised to mind his P's and Q's, that you didn't have to scratch too far to find that revolutionary spirit. But he, as you were saying, Bradley, he was more focused on music to begin. But my favorite bit about this is, at the end of it, when Fela's like, I was kind of being an asshole, and he's like yelling at these cops who are arresting him for, there shouldn't be an arrest here. This should just be a noise violation, give him a ticket kind of thing. But they arrest him, and Fela starts yelling at them about how he's going to sue them for wrongful arrest. He's going to take them down. And Fela laughs when he tells his story because he's like, these guys are just like, the cops are not buying one word of it. He's like, they know it's bullshit because I'm living in this like cheap little apartment. Like they know I don't have the money to take them to court and to try to arrest them, but he's still yelling it anyways, even though both him and the cops know that this is not happening. But that was kind of Fela in a nutshell. He was always someone who would kind of, you saw in him this ability to puff up when faced with kind of pointless authority. And so, it is a funny story, and it is something that kind of makes him realize that instance, not necessarily, but he talks a lot about being exposed to racism in a much different way in London than obviously he would be back in Nigeria. There's classism. Here, there's classism that is tightly tied to race. And he talks about seeing the signs that talk about no colors, and finding himself, he's like, hey, I'm supposed to be in the heart of the civilized world. And this stuff is here. And it's the first crack in Fela's belief that the British system in Nigeria is ultimately a good one. Because look, the Brits built all the lasting stuff, and what have we done for ourselves? And this is when he starts to question, wait, how good is this system? And what is it taking away from us?
So, Jibola, as you had mentioned earlier, Fela was musically inspired by performers like Frank Sinatra and Louis Armstrong. But when he returned to Nigeria, he was playing jazz music, but was told he wasn't very good at it and that he should stick to playing African music. And it was while seeing a James Brown cover band called Geraldo Pino and the Heartbreakers that inspired him to form a new African music that combined rock, jazz, and high life, which is the style of music from Ghana. Could you tell us about that concert that inspired him, and how did audiences respond to this new band that he put together?
So when Fela first came back from London, one of my favorite lines in the book was when Fela came out of jail in his first arrest in London. And shout out to Conor for coming up with this line. And he's talking to his best friend JK, and JK, he was like, I think it's time to go home. And do you think we can get shows at home? And JK is like, brother, can get you a gig on the moon, right? And then they get to Lagos, and Fela says, well, there's nobody in our clubs. We might as well be on the moon because there's nobody here, because initially when he was singing jazz and was singing just just classic jazz, kind of more in line to Miles Davis. So if you listen to a song like Amechi Blues, you could hear almost like a Miles Davis Fela version, right? Nobody was listening to this in Nigeria. Most people were listening to High Life. So there's actually an interview on YouTube where Fela says, yeah, jazz is not working in Nigeria, you know? And his mother famously told him, yeah, maybe you're not a good jazz musician, but if you listen to old school Fela jazz, it's actually quite good. But it was just not for the right audience. Anyway, he when then he found out about Gerald Opino, who was singing more James Brown covers. James Brown was also huge in Nigeria and in West Africa at the time. I think James Brown, if I'm correct, may have been influenced by West African sounds as well for him to create the sound he needed, which was kind of funky. So it was just us kind of listening to an Americanized version of West African sounds, right? And it's very interesting that when Fela listened to this, and when he saw Gerald Opino first time, it was like, wait a minute, the way this guy presents himself, right, is this over the top performer with big speakers and dancers and all of that. Fela felt, wait a minute, I should come to the stage like this in a very big way, you know? And when he went to the States and he met Sandra Izsadore, and he got influence, and he created Afrobeat, which is this new sound that he's going to be known for. And you could hear all these. I guess it's a concussion, right? Like some jazz, some funk, some high life, some calypso, mixed with a little bit of Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael in there, and Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti's mother, and he put this special concussion together. And when he brought this back to Nigeria, and people listened to his first hit called Jankoku, you can hear the James Brown in there too, right? You can hear the funk, but it's very traditional Yoruba sounds, right? The drums is like almost call and response sound, like stuff you hear whenever I would go to the village in Nigeria, and when I go hang out with my grandparents, those are the sounds you hear there, right? So when people heard that connected right away to people, you know? So that, and we try to make that connection for you as a reader, even though you're not from Nigeria and you didn't grow up in the 70s in West Africa, you're able to make sense of it.
So by this time in Fela's life in the late 1960s, while Nigeria was technically free from British rule, the country seemed to be falling apart economically and socially, and people were still trapped in this colonial mindset. And since audiences weren't really responding well to his music, a friend had encouraged Fela to go to America, and he did, as you mentioned. And he was in L.A. playing for a few months at a club called Citadel de Haiti. What was his experience like performing there in Los Angeles as compared with back home?
I mean, at first, I think for Fela, it was, that whole tour is actually really funny. So Fela makes up this story about how James Brown is hugely influenced by his music in the United States. And it's not true, but he does it because he knows it's going to get attention, and he does it because he's like, hey, maybe some tour company will hear that we're big in the US and get us there for a tour, because things just weren't working in Nigeria. And that does happen. He does get a tour. This story he tells works, and he gets to America, and he famously says the tour company that he had kind of cheated to bring him over here was ripping him off, because once he gets there, the tour company is nowhere to be found. And Fela and his band are basically on their own. There's no tour booked. There's nothing. In fact, the only time this tour company shows up is when Fela manages to hustle himself into a gig at Disneyland, playing the African Pavilion. And then this tour company shows up, and they're like, oh, well, we're the only guys who can book Fela and his band, and they ask for such a huge price that Disneyland is like, forget it, we're not going to do this. So Fela finds himself in LA. They're basically broke. A lot of their visas have now run out, so they're technically illegal. Fela kind of talks about the ridiculousness of people being illegal. Like, the actions are illegal, but how can people be illegal? But this is what he's facing. Citadel de Haiti was run by a local actor. And when Fela first gets there, it's kind of quiet, but it's LA and the people are open to different sounds. They're interested, right? LA has always been that kind of town. And so Fela's music starts to bring people in. And Fela talks at first, he's like, oh, well, this gig will work until I get something better. But he starts to really pack in an audience. And so Fela stays there, and it gets him exposed to more and more of the sounds that are happening in LA in the Black music scene there, stuff that's a little more underground than, say, James Brown. And it also introduces him to someone who's going to absolutely change his life, this woman, Sandra Izsadore. So Citadel de Haiti ends up being this pretty pivotal moment in his career.
So Sandra Izsadore has been mentioned a few times, and that's someone who he met in Los Angeles and would have a profound impact on him. And a bit about Sandra's background is that she was a frustrated singer herself, and she told Fela that it just wasn't enough for his music to entertain people, but that it needed to do something more than that. Can you give us a bit more background on Sandra and specifically the impact that she did have on Fela?
Sure. So I remember the first time I read about Sandra too, because I was like, oh, wait a minute, that is, I didn't know somebody else influenced the Fela, right? But it just probably came from his mother. But Sandra was a Black Panther, right? And she was she was also trying to make. I think she was saying how she was really into. She really wanted to learn more about Africa, and she was trying to find an African man who was going to teach her about Africa. But most of the African men she would meet are from small towns, mostly church boys, which we called Fela a church. Fela was also a church boy, right? But had become a bit more rough over the years. So when she met Fela, and Fela was talking about how, Black people were backward, and he was saying these things that made him seem just kind of like this colonized boy, basically. Sandra was shocked by this, right? And she was, she had been arrested for protesting. And she basically educated Fela on Malcolm X, on Stokely, introduced him to Nina Simone and all these different sounds. And you could say that Sandra was the midwife for Fela's revolutionary spirit and for Afrobeat. And Citadel de Haiti was the incubator, right, where Fela was just able to test out these sounds, and without Sandra, maybe we wouldn't have gotten the Fela that we have today, So it was just really interesting that he had to go to the US to discover his real self, right? And that's actually a pretty common story for people who are immigrants who become aware, because you grew up in one context, right, where you grew up in this bubble. I can also speak for myself here, right, where you grew up in this bubble of how you think the world is, and then you come to the West. Like I came to Canada. In Fela's case, he came to LA, and it was like, you're like, wait a minute, oh, like nobody actually knows anything about us back home. Oh, wait a minute, what, why is it you start asking these very interesting questions that you never had to ask yourself growing up in Nigeria? And I think for Fela, it just changed his worldview, and he became obsessed with it, that he carried that obsession for the rest of his life and infected everybody around him with this revolutionary spirit, right? So, and I think you can thank Sandra a little bit for that.
A big revelation that Fela had about his music, thanks to Sandra, was that he had been playing jazz without realizing why, and eventually coming to understand that jazz was music about Black struggle, Black beauty, and Black resilience. And this would lead him to write his first true song, one called My Lady Frustration, and which was the beginning of the new genre Fela would call Afrobeat, which you had mentioned earlier. Can you tell us how this song comes to define Afrobeat?
I mean, that's an interesting question, like whether it defines Afrobeat. It's kind of considered the first Afrobeat song, but it's interesting. Fela was it starts really downloading all this music that Sandra's put into him. And he's a deep thinker. He is a genius composer, right? This is one of the things that I think sometimes gets overshadowed in Fela's career, because there is a lot of, there's the sheer craziness of his life, right? 200 arrests, 28 wives, starting his own country, this firebrand who was fighting the Nigerian military government. And I think sometimes people underplay what a genius composer he was, right? Like by the end of his career, he's making literal classic music. And so Fela starts getting a lot of ideas around the music, but he's still struggling with, well, what do I want to say? And, his story for My Lady Frustration really comes out of him looking inward and recognizing that he's kind of actually really pissing Sandra off. Because at this point, he is staying at her house. He's eating her food. He's making long distance calls back to Nigeria. There's a famous story of him taking the car and forgetting it, and it gets towed. And Sandra's just apoplectic because, like, she loves this guy and she sees he's trying to build something, but he's this perfectionist. And she's like, this is America. Like, you got to figure out what you need to say. And that inspires him. Her frustration makes him look at himself and what he's trying to accomplish. And he sort of ties it into this bigger picture of the diaspora, this idea that that Africans as a whole have really, frustration is this stock and trade for them. The things they want in life, the things that have been taken from them in life, the way Africans have been taught to treat each other, especially in the diaspora, in the States at the time, right? There's this big conversation. This is where this quote unquote black on black crime conversation sort of begins. And so he's just looking at all that narrative, the falsehood of that narrative, which we know is false. And it leads him to build this song. And it's fun because it actually really influences his music going forward. Is the next thing Fela does after this is he does like Black Man's Cry, and he does these songs that are very much rooted in traditional Black protest music of the 60s. And so he goes home to Nigeria and he's singing these songs about, like, we have to get off the plantation. And of course, Nigerians have no context for this. So Nigerians are coming up to him after shows being like, so brother, like, should we not be farming? And Fela has to be like, oh, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something very different. But My Lady Frustration is the first step of the music that is going to define Afrobeat. And it's his first real conversation about using music in this political way. And it starts very personally. And from there, it's going to blow up and become something universal. I don't know, Jibola, would you say that's one of his most personal songs, My Lady Frustration, even though it's not? It really is very few not much in the way of lyrics, but the genesis of it is very personal.
Yeah, I would say so. I think I think it's in My Lady Frustration. There are no vocals. Excuse me. Right. It's just straight jazz. Right. And Fela chanting throughout the song. Right. And it's the only song where he sang it for somebody. Right. Everything else he sang for the people. And we were trying to make this case that Fela's songs are love songs, right? To Nigerians, to Black people, to anyone who cares about the world and wants to see a better world. It is a love song. But Fela famously would say he doesn't sing love songs, So My Lady Frustration maybe in a way was a celebration for Sandra, but Fela's songs going forward was a celebration for Nigerians and for Black people around the world.
I want to dive a little further into that because when Fela returns to Nigeria after having visa issues in Los Angeles, he goes and forms his new band called Africa 70. And his vision for this new band was that it would change Nigeria and that this new decade would belong to Nigerians, with him bringing the teachings of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. that he learned from Sandra. And this leads to songs that we've been mentioned before, like Black Man's Cry and Joan Koku. And as he's developing his musical styles even further, he's doing things with it like designing the horn arrangements to make the rhythms work like talking drums, and where the horns were telling these classic Nigerian stories within the music. And in the book, you write that Fela didn't want to Africanize his music, but rather to re-Africanize people's minds. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the context is that this was not too long after the independence. Yes, Nigeria's had a couple of coups, but things are not as bad as they are now. Was still generally functioning country, and was seen as one of the countries that would be the leaders of on the and leaders on the continent, right? So famously, there was this festival that most people haven't heard of called Festac 77, where it was, Nigeria was celebrating our emancipation or independence from the British, and we're celebrating African culture and history and all of that. And so many people, celebrities from all over the world, like Gil Roberto, Stevie Wonder, were all in Nigeria to come celebrate. And this was the kind of place Fela was, and this was a context, right? And I think that when people listen to Fela's songs and listen to what he was saying, it, I think that they always feel that Fela was kind of like way ahead of his time, because you have things that are happening. Like I said, like Nigeria was doing relatively well at that time, and Fela is critiquing the government at the time, and people were like, "What are you talking about? Like things are fine." But I think for some strange reason, yeah, because he's just such a genius and he was able to just sort of see what was happening. It was just like, watch out, that's an iceberg in front of us, but no one else could see it. And he was he at the time when, even until today, really, a lot of African songs, a lot of Nigerian songs are praise music. Like we would praise rich people, companies, kings, because that's just how it is. And Fela did the exact opposite. He mocked corporations, he mocked leaders, he mocked politicians, right? So he was kind of like forcing us to to reconnect with with African sounds, but use it to challenge the system. But at the time, I think people just could not. People enjoyed the music because they vibed to it and they understood what Fela was saying. But I think they just couldn't make that. They didn't have the deeper understanding to make that next step to just sort of challenge the system.
So, as his success as a musician grew, Fela he developed this communal compound that would serve as his home, recording studio, and base for his band and many wives. And we touched upon it earlier, and he would eventually call this compound the Kalakuta Republic as a way to mock the jail where he was held for several days. And while in jail, Fela anticipated having to fight for his life, but he came to realize that the people around him there weren't violent criminals, but rather were people being punished for being poor and are victims of the systemic abuse that was happening there. Could you tell us why Fela was sent to jail and how that experience influenced him musically?
Yeah, so this is a really, really funny story, and I it I when Connor initially wrote this part of the story, it was it was I think maybe about 20 or 30 pages long, and I was like, "Hey man, I think we need to cut it down," but it was just so good. So the reason fella got arrested was um y- actually the real story was like he had initially been arrested for something else. I don't remember what it was, but he had just gotten home, and um and he was just kicking back to relax, and he heard another knock at the door, and he looked through the peephole and he saw cops again, and he was like, wait, what? I just got back here, like what's going on? So, and he was just about to smoke up a joint, so he tossed the joint in the toilet and flushed it, right? So he opened up and he cleaned up the room, tossed everything out, and that was it. And then he opened the door, and the cops come in and they search the whole room, and they didn't find any weed in it in the room. And then they planted one, and they were like, "See, we found some weed in your house." At the time, if you're caught with hemp, which is what we called it in Nigeria at the time, you go to jail for 10 years. So the cop was like, "Hey, we found a joint at your house," and fella was like, "Let me see, bring it closer." And the guy brought it close to his face, and fella literally bit it and ate it, right? And he started laughing, and then they took him to a hospital, and they were like, "Hey, we're gonna wash your stomach so we can take we can prove that you had some marijuana in your system." So basically, they needed a sample of a stool, right? So eventually, they took him to jail so that they can just wait for him to poop so that they can take a sample. And it's pretty gross, but that's just what it was. And then when Fela was in jail for this, and this is one of the things we did that I was really happy about, that we touch on these themes on abolition, on colonialism, but it's actually not heavy in many ways. And sometimes we actually we try to contextualize it for the reader so they get it in real visceral ways. So Fela was in prison. I was like, wait, it's the poor, the uneducated that are in jail, right? So these people felt like Fela was their champion, and they helped him hide his stool so that he would never get caught. So by the time he was like, "Hey, I'm ready to poop now," the cops, when they tested him, they realized there was nothing in his system, but yeah. So I think that what was great about it is showing how Fela is also just such a trickster and such a almost like this Loki character, right? And but yeah, I think Conor, what do you think? Like, what are your thoughts on this? I just kind of want to get your take on it too.
I mean, it was the most fun. Like, I remember because the whole process. So one of the things we didn't talk about was when Jibola first brought me onto this project, he had been working on this idea for years, and he had come to me with a specific segment. We haven't really touched on it yet, but there's this famous attack on Fela's commune. Jibola mentioned earlier, 1,000 soldiers, literally 1,000 soldiers storm it. And so for Jibola, the original idea was to take this attack, because it's based on the song called Zombie. The soldiers would be literal zombies. The generals and the politicians would be animals, because Fela has this song "Beasts of No Nation" where he says that the politicians are like animals in human skin. And he was then going to use flashbacks to kind of explain, like, why are 1,000 soldiers attacking this guy's house? And so he brought it to me for notes, and I gave him my notes, and basically what I said was, there are so many great stories about Fela, and he's somehow both famous and also unknown at the same time, and that a lot of people might not get the context of this attack, even with the flashbacks. And so Jibola was like, "You're right. Like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the epic. I'm going to do the full bio of him, right? The full biopic." And then he came back a few weeks later and was like, "Dude, like, I really like the idea of this, but I don't know if I have the chops to write this." And he really liked some of the work I'd done. And so that's how I get involved. And so Jibola sends me away to write a script. And he's, he always talks about how, I thought this was going to be like, maybe 100 pages or something like that. And I came back with like 350 something pages. And Jibola was like, WTF, like, I got to draw this. What are you talking about? And so early on, Jibola was always like, I got to cut this thing down. So every time we had a meeting on a scene, if it was 6 pages, he's like, it should be 4. If it was 4 pages, it should be 2, right? If it's 2 pages, can we squish it into 1? And this scene was like, it's like 30 pages, and it goes through like 4 different time zones, and we travel around. And Jibola was like, I think it was the one that ultimately broke him, because he wanted it. Like, he's like, no way, we're not doing this. And he fought, and we fought, and we fought, and we fought. And I was like, all right, Jibola, so like, but what do you want to cut? And he was like, well, I can't. I'm like, should we cut this or this? He's like, well, we can't cut this part. We can't cut that part. So it ended up actually expanding a little bit. And I think it's the most interesting part of the book structurally, and the work Jibola does in it, that because we're in different time zones and different like emotions, the art changes within these 30 pages. It's like virtuoso work by Jibola. And yeah, I think what makes it so important is because it is, the whole thing comes down. So Jibola or Fela finally has, he finally has this shit. And I'm going to use that word because when his lawyer comes and gets him at the end of this whole process, he's like, Fela, you just had the most expensive shit in the history of Nigeria because of the arrest and the holding him and having to have doctors. And so Fela writes a song about the experience called Expensive Shit. And it is a legendary song. And it really shows how he would like mock authority. But I think one of the most important things that you touched on at the beginning, Bradley, was this idea that Fela talks about going into prison and still really believing that only prisoners, like only bad people are in prison. So he's actually really afraid because he's like, I'm going to get killed. I mean, Nigeria did have a reputation for having dangerous prisons. So that wasn't like a crazy middle class, like misreading of the situation. But when he gets in there and he sees that the people in jail are the people he's often singing about and that his music means so much to them, it really makes him see how the prison industrial system is used, not just in Nigeria, but in the world. And it kind of comes, there's one line that comes out of it that we kind of put into Fela's mouth that Jibola and I both really like. He's talking about how when white collar crime occurs, we have all these other fancy names for it, like misappropriation, right? It's embezzlement. And he's like, no, it's stealing. And he's like, who's doing more damage? The guy in the alleyway who's trying to like rob you with a knife, taking your wallet, or the politician or the corporation that's taking millions of naira that's meant for an entire city? Like, why do you think that desperate guy is in the alley in the first place? And so it's another moment where Fela's politics shift because of this experience of being in jail and realizing that, like you said, Bradley, the vast majority of people are there, their crime is being poor. And I think it shifted how he wanted to talk to the people of Nigeria.
The interesting thing when I was reading through your book is there's a lot of just amazing stories about Fela and all the, legends and trickster shenanigans he gets to. And those are all entertaining in their own right. But I'm really fascinated by all these kind of artistic and personal shifts that he makes, because after he comes out of jail, around this time, Sandra visits him in Nigeria to stay with him and record music. But things are a lot different than when they were together back in Los Angeles. Besides being taken aback that Fela has 24 wives who he rotates through on a sex schedule, Sandra is very uncomfortable about the misogyny she hears in his lyrics and confronts him about it. And as a result, Fela, who is this band leader and runs this compound and has a particular vision for his music, he breaks his own rule about not writing a song for another person, and he ends up writing a song called Upside Down for Sandra to sing. Can you tell us about that song?
About the song Upside Down?
Yeah, just about Upside Down and, that kind of interaction between him and Sandra that would lead him to break his own rule and write that. Because for me, that's kind of a... that's a particular shift. I think a lot of people would be very, wary to accept the feminist bona fides of a man who has 24 wives, but clearly his mother as well as Sandra were women who had very significant impacts on him. So I just wanted to learn a little bit more, understand about how Sandra continued to influence him, and I think that song is a big touchstone for that.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the things we tried to do here was to show all the complexities around Fela, right? And I think up until now you would get just almost a flattening of him, not so much a sanctification of him, kind of like your Martin Luther King, right? But like you get a different version of Fela where people just didn't really. You get the fetishizing of him a little bit, where people see him as just this agitator, or people see him as just a musician, right? Or people just don't know him at all, right? And with Sandra, we're able to do so many things. We're able to tell a love song, a love story, with Sandra, because Fela and Sandra have this really deep connection, right? And Fela loves and respects her and vice versa, right? And you Fela broke his rule twice for Sandra, right? One for singing My Lady Frustration for her in LA, and also when she did Upside Down. I think that's the only other female musician Fela collaborates with, if I'm thinking out loud here, right? And the song Upside Down is mostly led by Sandra, and Sandra is in Nigeria for the first time, living in the commune with several other women that are Fela's wives. This is somebody who grew up in the U.S. in the South. So this is a totally different context for her, and she's just trying to uh, understand this new world that she's living in, and as well, and also critiquing Nigeria as well, because in that song, Upside Down, she was like, wait a minute, like, why is it that, um, why is it that Nigerians change their names to, to British sounding names when we have when Nigerian and our African names have this huge meanings behind them, like when you go to Germany, Germans have German names. If you go to China, people have Chinese names. But in Nigeria, you get Mr. Ransom, this and that, right? So Sandra was just sort of critiquing that, because she was like, Nigerians need to embrace themselves more, embrace their history, embrace their culture, right? And that was what that song was all about. And it's really on brand for something Fela would say as well.
So as we're coming to a close, it's been touched upon a few times, but I do want to bring up that very significant night when the Nigerian army sent 1,000 soldiers to raid his compound. Because he had organized in 1977 this festival, Festac, and it was a local arts and culture festival, and Fela had certain ideas and demands, about it, like having all the musicians pick their own songs. But he also didn't believe that the government had good intentions given their corruption and appeal to Western and European business investments. And this leads to the song Zombie that he would perform on stage as like part of this counter festival. And Zombie is about the soldiers just being mindless, beings following their orders. And this attack was carried out by 1,000 soldiers, destroyed Fela's studio and master tapes, which I can only imagine the wealth of material that was on that. And they beat a lot of people there, including Fela, but the response from the government was that the violence was committed between the people in the compound. However, during the attack, Fela's mother was thrown out of a window, and she later succumbed to her injuries. And after the funeral, Fela led a demonstration to protest the government for killing his mother. I have a two-part question here. How did Fela carry out that protest in your book, and how did it actually happen? And, that significance of that for him.
Yeah. So Festac 77, to put it on to give you context, was like a celebration of Nigerian culture and history and all of that. This was at a time where Nigerian naira had more value than the dollar, right? We had the oil boom, like the Nigerian economy was doing really well. The president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, at the time, was arguably the most powerful person in the continent at that time. This was a guy who grew up relatively poor, not too far from Fela. I think they grew up in the same neighborhood, and Fela was, grew up upper middle class in the same town, Abeokuta, that we mentioned earlier on, right? So so one of the things we did was OBJ, Obasanjo, like we call him OBJ in Nigeria. One of the things we did was we wanted to make sure, him being the main antagonist to Fela, that they had this one face-to-face moment, right? Where OBJ says, we want you to be part of this huge festival, which makes sense because Fela is Elvis at this time, right? And OBJ is the most powerful man, in the country. And anyone coming to Nigeria, like I said earlier, Sunrise in Nigeria, the Beatles are in Nigeria. This is a big, big deal. It will be strange for the biggest star in Nigeria to not be part of this event. And Fela is like, all right, cool. If you want me to be part of this event, you can't, I have this 9-point demand. It wasn't even about him. It was like, people can sing their own song, no censorship. You can't brutalize people on the streets. You can't do this and that. And and the military should not be running an arts festival, which is bars, right? That makes sense, And that was when the conversation broke apart, right? And that led to Fela saying, I'm gonna sing this song Zombie, which was banned at the time in Nigeria. And OBJ saying, listen, if you embarrass me and embarrass the country, there'll be hell to pay. And Fela does the counter Festac party where everybody, all the who's came to Fela's counter Festac party and not to the Festac party that the government literally paid for. So there was an altercation that actually happened after this, where some soldiers, some of Fela's boys got into an altercation with a soldier, and that led to that, I guess, was the trigger that actually sent the 1,000 soldiers to come down to Fela's house, right? And when they came, they beat Fela up so much that I said he could hear his bones crack in his body, and he felt his soul leave his body, and they assaulted his women, which, now that I think about it, it was, it was more, Fela was known for his women. So his women being assaulted was almost like a direct hit for him, for something that would really hurt him, And, he was taken to jail, and after being in jail for 28 days, he came back and sang the same song again on stage, and then does another song called Unknown Soldier that accounts for what actually happened in that song that you can listen to. So I think that when you read the book, one of the interesting things we did visually was before the attack, you have this pretty traditional graphic novel style where you have your grids and it's something you would expect in a graphic novel visually. And then after the attack, you get a totally different art style, right? The art direction changes to more darker, more abstract, and even the line art is different and more edgy, and it starts to feel more and more claustrophobic, just to show how the impact of the music of that attack in Fela's life and to his music.
The attack on his compound was a major turning point for Fela in so many ways, and your book explores what happened throughout his life after that, but I want to leave that for the readers to discover for themselves. And however, as this is the first interview I've ever done for a graphic novel, I want to talk a little bit about that before we finish. And I was very interested to see at the beginning of your book and at other parts that signal a new phase of his life and career, there are these mythical scenes of a young boy following a type of spirit. What do these scenes mean to you within the context of the story you're telling about Fela and the power of his music?
That's a good question too. So we start the story in this spiritual dream world, right? Most people don't know anything about Yoruba mythology, Yoruba spirituality, or anything like that. And we thought it would be a great way to kind of educate the audience and to get them to explore a little bit about our world and about the Yoruba imagination. And this spirit girl was someone who was Fela's guide throughout the book, almost like his conscience, so to speak, right? And it's kind of like open for interpretation who she is and what she's meant to be, but we actually leave in few clues in there for you to actually discover that she is an actual goddess, but we don't quite tell you what she is, but she's supposed to have layered meanings to her as well. But I'll let Connor jump in to talk a little bit about this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, when we were doing our research, we kind of looked at her as this kind of mixture of Oshun, who's like the goddess of like fertility and like beauty, and also Eshu, who's like the trickster goddess, because she kind of fulfills both those purposes. I think a big part of it was not to give too much away, like you're saying, Bradley, for the rest of the story, but after the Kalakuta attack, Fela becomes more obsessed with sort of vengeance, and a lot of how he's looking at the world is about wanting to, he runs for president, right? He wants to run Nigeria. He wants to make a better Nigeria, but he also wants to have the ability to like to punish the people who killed his mother, right? Like his mother dying is this huge thing for him. And so in that part of his career, he starts getting more and more invested in Nigerian spirituality. And it is both a strength for him, but it leads him to this guy called Professor Hindu, who ends up being this charlatan. And it creates this almost like weird a situation like the Crucible style, where all of a sudden people are accusing each other of having evil spirits. And in many ways, it kind of, part of his spirituality kind of pushes him into some darker places. And because we were having this commentary on Hindu and we're talking about how the spirituality was used as a weapon against Fela, it was really important, especially for Jibola, to make sure that we showed that the traditional Yoruba mythology and the traditional spiritual religions were beautiful, and they were valid, and they're as valid as any other religion or mythology that any other culture has. And so using those, they were great because it allowed us to do some interstitials. It lets us jump between time periods seamlessly when we want to. A lot of people have told us when they open the book and it starts in this dream sequence that they're very taken aback because they're expecting something very different, like, oh, this is going to be a very nuts and bolts, like it's going to be a biopic, and they're not expecting it to start off with basically magical realism. So it kind of seeds the idea of the innate magical nature of Nigerian storytelling. And so, yeah, a big part of it was to kind of confound expectations. It gave us a device to be able to move through. It underpins that idea that Fela was singing love songs, because it's in these sequences that Fela is confronted about his love for his people and the idea of love songs. But it also was something to make sure that if you were coming to the story and you had no knowledge of Yoruba mythology, Yoruba traditional religion, that you weren't going to just see the last part of the book and be like, oh, it's all like mumbo jumbo. It's all, fake witch doctor kind of things, that you'd be able to appreciate the beautiful parts of that spirituality. But like any other religion, there are going to be people who are doing things in the name of religion, or individuals who are using that religion to enrich themselves and to wield power over others, which ironically was something Fela called out a lot in his music, but he was a little blind to that at the end of his life.
And it's interesting visually to see that, because at the beginning there's a lot of pinks and purples and magentas, and then it just gets darker and darker. And I think it's just really fascinating. And further beyond that, while your book is a biography on Fela, there are moments where you indulge in some of the urban legends that surround him, such as driving a bus through the gate of the army barracks to deliver his mother's coffin to the military head of state. And reading that, I got the sense that, you don't usually see these kind of moments in biographies. So how did the medium of the graphic novel allow you to expand on Fela's legacy in ways that other types of books just can't?
Oh man, I love that question. I think that's one of the great things about having it as a graphic novel, right? Because you could really show these stories that would be very difficult to show otherwise, on that particular story where Fela drove to the army barracks, and he was shot at, and they didn't get killed. They, there, it seemed like a story that actually did happen, And there are many stories about soldiers literally just driving in front of Kalakuta Republic, and just shooting at the place. This is actually really commonly known. And just shooting at the police and just driving up, just doing like a random drive-by or a random Tuesday, you know? And the other thing too is that when Nigerians tell stories, and I think West Africans tell stories, just everyday stories, there's a bit of magic, a little bit of mysticism that just sort of automatically weaved into the story, So when we were telling the story, we wanted to make sure you had that magic element. And I, for me, I always thought that we just don't get the stories like that in Nigeria. It's either just magic or just history or just politics, or you know what I mean? That's just all like siloed. And I'm like, wait, we can mix this up and remix it and have a good time with the story, And it was very important designing the story in a way where, Fela telling you something that is extraordinary, we've already created the context for you. So it doesn't seem so extraordinary. It just seems like, oh yeah, I understand why I'm hearing this story this way. And we sort of cultivate you to get to that point, right? So you open the book and you're introduced to this dream world, and then you get to London, and then as the story goes on, it starts to become more and more mythical and magical, and it becomes very difficult to differentiate between what's true and what's not. There's this really famous song of Fela called Rapa Rapa Fight, where he talks about two friends fighting in the mud, and somebody's trying to separate them, but doesn't know which one is his friend, right? And because they're all covered in mud, you can't tell which one is your friend to stop the fight. Anyway, we kind of do that at the end of the story where Fela is fighting, but fighting all these demons, but then he realized that he's actually fighting himself too, right? And as you, as the reader, are going through it, you find it very difficult. It's like, wait, what is true and what's not? I'm actually going to go spend some time to read more about this to figure out the history. And if we're able to do that at the end of the story, where you go and you start to dig and you're inspired, then that's a huge win.
Jibola, this question is directly for you. And in the book's introduction, you talk about the impact that Fela's life and work had on you. And with regards to seeing the Broadway musical about him, in your book, you write that it was not another slavery story, not a colonization story, and that you felt this deep shame because you had the question of how Nigerians did not celebrate their own champions. Having worked on this book and now seeing it out there, have you found yourself reconciling those feelings?
I think it's the first time anybody has asked me that. I think that, where it's really strange that Fela's mother, right, when she was thrown out of a second floor window, and she, she eventually died of her wounds. And just given her history and who she was and how important she is, you could argue she's kind of like a George Washington or a Martin Luther King sort of or JFK there, but the Nigerian government actually never apologized for that incident, till this day. So I feel like there's this underlying tone of like we celebrate our heroes in some ways, but other ways we don't give a shit, It shouldn't be possible that something like that would happen in Nigeria, and for it not to be so condemned and so frowned upon that, to this, like Fela's mom, to this day, people would just say, "Oh, she's the woman the first woman to drive a car in Nigeria." People don't know much about her, right? So that's why you get people being able to sort of tell our stories for us, because we don't champion our stories. So for me, telling Fela's story in this big way is just to reassert that, you know, that to, put him on that pedestal and say, yo, we produced this really great artist. We should celebrate it to the high heavens in all its beauty, its honest complexities and contradictions. And we should do that for all our heroes, because it helps us, reminds us who we are, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, and we helps us see the future. So this is, my way of doing that as an artist, because that's something I see in the world. And as an artist, I wanted to put it out there so that, the world sees our stories, Nigerians see themselves as well, and champion more stories like this. So the world is getting smaller with globalization and with technology. We need to learn more about each other, right? So this is my way of doing that.
So to close things out, I've got a softball question for you fellas. What are some of your favorite Fela songs or albums?
All right, Conor, I'll let you go first.
Oh, I mean, I'll take one of my favorites is Wata No Get Enemy. It's just this very smooth, accessible track. Because the one of the things about Fela's music is a lot of his songs, even his short songs are long. You're talking 8, 9, 10, 12 minutes. And then his long songs are really long, 30, 40 minutes. So Wata No Get Enemy is one you can get into pretty easily. It's very groovy. Junkoku, which we talked before, is actually a really interesting song. I really like that song as well. And what else will I do? I'll do a deep cut from the Kula Libidos era of Fela, which is kind of when he was doing jazz. There's a song called Lai Shao that is just a really good example of what Fela was up to before he becomes the king of Afrobeat. And, while him choosing to become the king of Afrobeat was the right decision, Lai Shao makes you realize that if he just played music like that his whole career, they still would have been, it still would have been fire. So I think those are all very fun songs. And I'm going to do ODD, which is like a Overtake, Don't Overtake. ODO is like another great, it's a longer song. It's a really interesting song that kind of changes a few times in it. So, but you really can't go wrong. Whatever song you pick with Fela is going to be great.
Yeah, those are good ones. You stole a couple that of mine there. So, my
I almost took your favorite one, but I was like, nah, I can't do that. I can't do that. That's just me being mean.
No, my favorite is easily Look and Laugh, which Fela basically sings about nihilism. It's like a 30-minute deep cut. It's so beautiful. It's almost like this spiritual song that you could just sort of listen to when you just want to kick back and chill and read Fela graphic novel, There is another one, the Gentleman is also a great one to listen to. And Zombie, I don't know if you mentioned that already, Fela, Conor. Zombie is a fantastic song to listen to. It's like the hardest punk, hip hop, jazz song you've ever heard in your life, right? So it's almost this event, this experience that you have to just sort of just to experience. And lastly, I would say this one is hard to say. Equalization of trouser and pants. That I would say that's my other favorite one.
Well, thank you, Jibola and Conor, for speaking with me today. Great work in telling the story of this larger-than-life musical icon, and with such beautiful and stunning artistry, I think you both should be very, very proud.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been really great to see the reaction. We were actually on a panel the other day with somebody who had lived with Fela, and I think we got this great compliment where he was like, "I was really skeptical about this book." When I heard about it, and he read it and said that he really felt that we had done Fela justice, which is all we really wanted to do, because he is, he's a musical giant, but he's just someone that his story is important. And, anybody out there, if you still don't really understand what's going on here, pick up the book. You're going to love it.
Yeah. Thank you, Bradley, for having us. It was a great experience working on it, and it was really nice talking to you. A good place for people to check us out is felagraphicnovel.com. There's actually an excerpt of the graphic novel on the website that you could check out of the expensive shit story. So that's something to read up on as well.
Free comics.
My name is Bradley Morgan, and you've been listening to New Books and Music with my guests Jibola Fagbamiye and Conor McCreery. Their latest book is Fela, Music is the Weapon, and is published by Amistad.